right, it is 5:35 p.m. on July 16th, 2014. I'd like to call this meeting of the Urbana IDOT Traffic Stop Data Task Force to order. I'll get that out of my mouth one of these days. Can I have a roll call, please?
Patricia Avery, Andrew Charles, Shinjini Chattopadhyay, Nicole Anderson Cobb, yes. Alejandra Coronel,
yes.
Eric Jacobson,
Yes.
Will Kiles,
Yes.
Peter Resnick,
Yes?
Chandra Somerville, and Paul Testa.
Yes.
And I'll remind folks to turn on your microphone when you're speaking so that folks out there and on the recording can hear you. All right, so move to our approval of the agenda. We had some mention by a member of the public that they might have input up front. I'm happy to take public input wherever folks want it, but if folks want to make a motion or change the agenda, please do so.
I guess that's a no, right?
I need a motion.
I'd like to make a motion to, what are you going to do, amend it or just change it?
Or just a change?
Sure. Just change the agenda so that public discussion comment is in the front of the meeting as opposed to the back.
All right, so I have a motion. Do I have a second?
Second.
All right, so a motion by Mr. Kiles, a second by Mr. Jacobson to have the agenda as stated with public input up as the next agenda item. Any further discussion or changes to the agenda? All right, hearing none. Can all those in favor please say aye?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, so that motion passes. So next item on the agenda then is public input. Invite any members of the public to come up and speak if they wish. Oh, well, we'll get to that in old business, but yes. If you have stuff to hand out, please make sure it starts over at our clerk and it'll make its way around, or we can get it after.
My name is Darrell Cruz, and I thought it might be appropriate just to take a second to introduce myself and make a few comments, since I shared some information with Todd and Peter, and I think they've passed it on to the committee, and I think it would be helpful just to put a face with a name so you know who that person is. I'm Darrell Cruz, and I've been interested in the traffic stop data for the past 8 years. And I'm really excited about the work that this committee is about to embark upon. And a couple of comments I would like to make very quickly, just some contextual things and some thoughts or ideas to share with you in terms of how you might want to progress and organize yourself in your subcommittees. I do want to state that it was in October of last year that 6 community groups, the Champaign Citizens for Peace and Justice and the Champaign County ACLU and the NAACP of Champaign County and the Ministerial Alliance of Champaign-Urbana, the League of Women's Voters of Champaign County, and the Central Illinois Jobs with Justice petitioned the City Council of Urbana to form this committee. And I share that with you, and the City Council acted upon that petition. I share that with you because I want to convey to you that there is a broad interest in community organizations in Urbana about the racial disparities that exist in the traffic stops, and that even though you were contacted by city staff and appointed and accepted to serve on this task force, that you're representing, I think, the citizens of Urbana in regards to an Urbana issue and an Urbana problem. And the fundamental question is why do racial disparities exist? How can we understand why they're occurring, and what can we do to reduce them? I think that was the concern of the 6 community organizations that petitioned the city. Along in light with that, I very quickly just want to highlight a couple of the things that I shared with you for context and then let you get about your business. One of the most difficult items, I think, in this traffic stop study has been identification of what's an appropriate benchmark. And part of that has been the discussion is based upon some of the shortcomings of the census-adjusted benchmark. And obviously there are some concerns there, and you may be aware of those. I would like to suggest to you as you look at that I think it's important that there be some establishment of a benchmark or at least a range that you can agree to, and I'll give you a couple of reasons for that very quickly. And I would like to suggest that in the 2004 state report, they suggested several ways to identify a benchmark, and one of those was traffic accident data. And I gave you some information on that, and you can look at it, and it may be another very good way to help validate or establish a reasonable range that you can establish a benchmark, especially in a ratio in terms of African American drivers. Really what the community is concerned about is the disparities as they exist primarily for African American drivers, not minorities as a whole, although there are some little pockets of disparities that exist there. But fundamentally, the big major problem is across the board how traffic stop enforcement creates racial disparities for African American drivers primarily. And so I think the ratio is important because if you make recommendations, when I talked to Dr. Al Weiss a couple of years ago, I asked him what's a statistically significant ratio, and he said 3.3 or 0.4. And what that would suggest is that anything less than maybe 1.35 is not significant. So if you look at recommendations and a city wants to determine if it's making progress at mitigating traffic stops in terms of their inequity, you need to have a benchmark that next year and the following year the city can kind of use to reference new data to see if you're reaching that benchmark that might be established. And I think it's important maybe to establish some benchmark so that you can see if progress is being made in year 2, 3, or 4 as it's being reduced. Another topic.
Just to let you
Yes.
know, you've used 4 minutes, so
Okay,
if you
I'm
could
going
wrap
to go
things
really
up.
quick. Just
Thank you.
tell me when there's 10 seconds left. On racial profiling, I gave you some information. I think it's a high priority within the community, and there's some statistical ways you can do that just by drilling down some existing data that UPD can give you. I would encourage you to look at that issue early on and see if there's a way to see if that's occurring in the data. And finally, I would like to suggest to you that one of the first things you might want to think about doing, and it was suggested in the 2004 report, is to simply have a conversation with your Urbana Police Department. You know, you look at the data, see what disparities are there, and before anybody starts claiming they know why they exist, we might just want to ask the officers on the street, why do you think, you know, these numbers exist the way they do? What do you understand the circumstances to be? And by having that conversation with the police department, then one can begin maybe framing other questions and drilling down a little bit with that. So there's some suggestions, and I appreciate the work and look forward to it, and we'll be watching closely. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions for Mr. Cruz while we've got him here? All right, any other public input? All right, so switching around and moving back to my agenda. Next item on the agenda is old business, approval of revised bylaws. There were some suggested changes to the bylaws. Todd, could you go over, you sent out in the packet a couple of items that changed.
Sure.
Let us know what you've got.
So during the discussion last month, there were a couple of requests for changes to the bylaws, or at least some language that may work. The first language has to do with closed sessions, and you'll find that in section 4 on page 3 towards the top, and obviously the added language is underlined. And so what I've tried to do is sort of take boilerplate language from other bylaws and discuss how we would do a closed session in Illinois. So that's the first change that we made. And then the second request was for the addition of language that would cover member submission of agenda items. And so there's a really brief little paragraph on that in section 8 at the bottom of page 3. And then I also tried to clean it up a little bit and get rid of any references to public hearings. The first revision, or the first change I made on page 2, section 2 under article 3, under the chair, I should have actually stricken not just the word hearing, but the word and after that. So as we find other typos, we'll try to get those rectified also. But I think that covers pretty much what I've done with them. Not much, but I'm happy to answer any questions about the language or.
Any questions for Todd? Yeah, Ms. Avery?
I want to first thank you for getting this done for this meeting. But I did have a question under section 3, just for clarification. It says that any special meeting can be called on the request of 2 or more members, provided there is no less than 48 hours notice. But then, here's where I need clarity, where it says additionally, no special meeting shall be held without the oral approval of a quorum. So is that, if we have 2 or more members agree to have a special meeting, why would it be necessary for the approval of a quorum?
To be honest with you, when I first read through that, and this, again, these are taken from the HRC's bylaws. Honestly, what I thought that this may mean, because they were written a little bit before my time, is that, so you may have 2 members who actually agree that everyone should meet, but if you actually don't have a quorum to be able to show up, and normally that would consist of us calling people or sending out an email saying who can actually show up to the meeting. If you don't have a quorum of people who are willing to show up, or at least say they're going to show up, then there's really no point in scheduling the meeting. And so that's what I read into that. I'm not exactly sure what the reasoning was initially for that language.
And I think it's making the distinction between a meeting may be called by 2 members, but it will not be held unless a quorum agrees to it. And I was wondering, by the way, you struck some of the bit there. Was there a reason for striking the bit in the middle?
Yeah, because it's referring to
Oh, it was
hearings.
referring to the hearings.
Yes.
Okay. Yes. Other questions? Mr. Jacobson?
Could I make a suggestion on this point? Maybe this would clarify. No special meeting shall be held without the participation of a quorum of the task force. So you won't actually have the meeting unless a quorum shows up, and that would be completely clear.
We don't have a motion on the floor, so I mean, we're sort of free discussing right now, but it is the sense of the group that that would be okay to make the change. So when someone wants to move this, we'll do it with that
Okay.
change added in. Any other questions for Todd? So I'll entertain a motion for these changes to the bylaws. Oh, yes, I'm sorry. Ms. Avery?
There was another question on
Please.
section 11.
Section 11 of which article? Oh, of Article 5?
Yes. I guess my question was why did we strike that there would be an affirmative vote of the majority regarding closed public hearing?
Again, I basically went through and struck any language that refers to hearings because typically those are sort of the quasi-judicial hearings that are held by the HRC, the Human Relations Commission. And that's not something that's necessarily contemplated or anticipated in terms of the task force.
Any other questions?
I do have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
My question is about subcommittee business. There doesn't seem to be any language around how subcommittees will do their work in the bylaws, and I'm just wondering is there a separate set of bylaws for subcommittee business, or is this something that should be taken up here?
So, subcommittees, you do remember that we are following Robert's Rules of Order for the most part. So subcommittees are available as part of that, and there's no specific language in here. Did you have anything that you thought, like specific rules of operation you thought we might want to include?
Well, I know that the subcommittees will break down into smaller groups, and they will have their own quorum rules. So that's
presume.
my concern.
I don't know, Todd, do you think there's an issue here that we need to address in the bylaws, or?
You know, I'm open either way. Certainly, it would lend some greater structure to the subcommittees. However, what I would say is, to the extent that the subcommittees are made up of, I think it's probably with this group, maybe 3 or more people, they would have to be open anyway.
Right.
So I was kind of thinking that they would more than likely be made up of 3 or less, or perhaps 2 people per assignment. And that sort of allows quite a bit of work to be done, and then all of the work to be presented to the full committee in open meeting. But again, I'm pretty neutral on the inclusion of language and structure for subcommittees.
So, I guess on that point, if you've got some ideas of putting something specific in, we can always take that up next meeting, because we do have on the agenda talking about subcommittees this time and setting them up. For the time being, I think I'm comfortable as chair just using whatever's in Robert's rules to deal with the subcommittee and use the rest of the bylaws to do that. If you come up with something particular, or in the process of working the subcommittees, we realize we're missing something, we can easily revisit, so.
I mention it too only because with the Open Meetings Act training, there's a lot of conversation
Yep.
about how subcommittees function, what kind of justifies their legitimacy, so I wanted to be really mindful of that.
I appreciate that, yeah, and I think that makes sense. And so long as the subcommittees do constitute a majority of a quorum, which is gonna be 4, then the open meeting stuff would kick in.
Right.
So if we keep the subcommittees to 3, then we don't have the open meetings concerns. But, okay, good. Any other questions for Todd about the changes? Yes, ma'am.
Just going back to the language in section 3, a quorum of this body is 5.
6.
It's gonna be 6, because we're 10 appointees.
Should
Where are
we
we at?
include that language in possible?
So is that not said here? That's interesting. We never defined a quorum, did we?
No, we did not. And you know why? Because the HR ordinance defines a quorum. for
Defines a
the-
quorum for us, so, yes, we should probably do that. So, again, so now we have 2 things. When someone makes the motion, definition of a quorum, and then the change regarding the calling of special meetings. Yes, sir.
We don't have an attorney here, but my impression is that for any body any public body that's subject to Open Meetings Act, the quorum is a majority of the members.
So,
That's my impression, but I can't.
well, and
Okay.
so the Human Relations Commission is interesting because by ordinance, the quorum is defined simply as 4, even though that's not a majority of the HRC. And I believe the Open Meetings Act it's either defined by the body or is a majority. So we can do it either way, but I think I agree with your assessment that a majority is the safe and obvious one to choose, so. All right, anything else? So I'll entertain a motion if someone can get it out with all of the changes in there.
I'll move adoption of the bylaws with all of the amendments that Mr. Rent put in, plus the amendment that in Section 3, no special meeting shall be held without the presence of a quorum of the task force.
So I have a motion. Do I have a second?
Second.
Okay, so a motion by Mr. Jacobson, a second by Mr. Kiles. Did someone want to put in a friendly amendment about the size of the quorum? To add that? Ms. Avery?
Yeah, I'll make that motion
And,
to include language that defines what a quorum
and as,
constitutes a
And as what number?
as 6 being, the number that, the majority.
So,
Well, we could go with a hard number, the majority of those present or the majority
of the appointees. Mr. Rent?
Can I make a suggestion that it be a majority of the sitting members?
Does that work for everybody?
that works.
Okay, so I have a friendly amendment by Ms. Avery that language be added, and where would we like this added? We could put this simply in,
Other meetings?
yeah, in the meetings.
Yeah.
So we'll add that a quorum will be defined as a majority of the, I'm sorry, give me the line, sitting members. Will you take that as a friendly amendment, Mr. Jacobson?
If I understand rightly, sitting members are those appointed, but, for example, suppose there was a vacancy, somebody got sick and had to drop off because of an emergency, then the number of sitting members would temporarily decline by 1, and the quorum would still be a majority of the appointed members minus 1. Okay, got it. Okay, yes, with that understanding, I take that as a friendly amendment.
And Mr. Kiles, do you take that as a friendly amendment?
Yes.
All right, so we now have a motion with the friendly amendment. Do our staff folks have that all written down? Good. Any further discussion on changes to the bylaws? All right, I think we need a roll call vote for this. Mr. Weck?
Patricia Avery,
Yes.
Andrew Charles,
Yes.
Nicole Anderson Cobb,
Yes.
Alejandra Coronel,
Yes.
Eric Jacobson,
Yes.
Will Kyle,
Yes.
Peter Resnick,
Yes?
Paul Testa.
Yes.
All right, that passes unanimously. Thank you, folks. Details I know, but we're just getting started and those will happen. All right, so moving on to new business. We have one item of new business, which is discussion of subcommittees and assignments. Todd and I met earlier this week, or was it last week? It's been a long week. Would you get us started, or would you like me to just start us down the road?
Well, I think what we discussed was the expectation that this task force will actually produce a report at the end of, I guess, the tenure of the task force. And in furtherance of producing that report, and really in getting to the core issue that the task force is really trying to investigate, the thought was to separate into various subcommittees that could be assigned individual pieces of the report. So for instance, and do that at least somewhat based upon specialization. So the most easy one in my mind is, for instance, a statistics subcommittee, that the assignment basically would be something like to investigate and find the best measurement methods or testing methods or benchmarks for the committee to apply to the data that exist. And for instance, maybe a social science subcommittee to really look at the language issues and the historical issues regarding the different terms that we're going to be using, for instance, racial profiling, racial disparity, and to look at it not just from a statistical scientific standpoint, but also from more of a sociological standpoint. And to look at for instance, in terms of the community impact of just the perceptions of disparity. So I guess there are quite a few possibilities, and we were hoping that sort of discussing it amongst yourselves, that you all would come up with some great ideas for how you could subdivide out the work and sort of get started on those assignments. And I apologize if the agenda item was a little ambiguous in terms of what we were actually thinking. I'll try to make it a little bit more clear in the future, but that's kind of what we were thinking. So we were hoping to divide up and then to actually make assignments and get everybody going.
So I'd like this to pretty much be an open discussion of what folks think as far as those divisions. As Todd said, he and I discussed having a committee to deal with statistical issues, for which the initial homework assignment is going to be come back with some benchmarks and some ideas of how we can even look at the data, and then sort of a social sciences, sociological subcommittee, and their first assignment might be to examine what kinds of impacts we're going to be looking for and the effects on the community, whether it's issues in conscious racial profiling all the way to there are these disparities due to what we foresee as reasonable or good circumstances and how those might impact differently. So those were the two ideas we came up with, and I'd love to hear from folks if you think we should have additional subcommittees or different aim of those subcommittees at the get-go. Ms. Cobb.
I'd just like to start out by suggesting, after kind of looking at the police department data that was distributed to us, I would suggest that the task force consider another subcommittee that I would argue could deal with police procedure and public engagement. And I say that for a number of reasons. As a lay citizen, I myself went into kind of launched into this effort to find the actual law. As a citizen, if I'm concerned about being stopped, how do I know what the law is and what are the expectations around a traffic stop? I went to the City of Urbana website, I went to the Urbana Police website and found very little. There were the Cops Corner videos available, which are 3-minute informational videos prepared by Officer Bailey that provide information on a range of subjects. The 3-minute presentation that Officer Bailey provides gives us an opportunity to come to understand what's expected of a citizen on a traffic stop. However, it does not address searches, and it does not address dog searches. And it also fails to address false searches, which are deemed important as the Act lays out. It also does not help us understand where stop card information goes. If one is not given a citation or written warning, there is a verbal warning / stop card that is documented, that is available. I'm also concerned about where the stop card information goes. It seems to me that an officer collects that data, but where does the information go and can a citizen access that information? Also, one of the things that's been striking to me is the issue of the level of profiling as it reflects on both Latino drivers and this whole issue of Latino stops as well as Asian stops. And one of the things I did in terms of looking over the city website and the police website is, again, Officer Bailey gives us short videos to address a number of areas. And there is a bilingual video presentation that my colleague participated in, but it doesn't address the issue of stops or searches. It deals with issues of texting while driving and some other matters. So what I'm concerned about is the fact that we see a spike in Latino stops. We see a spike in 2013 of Asian stops. And so what I'm concerned about is the fact that we don't have none of these videos are available in languages that these communities can access in regard to their rights and responsibilities around stops. And the other thing is that I think that part of the work of this committee has to be to engage its citizenry, which is why I very much receive our guest's comment about the fact that that we do need to talk with law enforcement to get clarity on police procedure, but also provide an opportunity for community to learn what its responsibilities are in regard to a stop and or search, and also understand what law enforcement's responsibility is on these very issues. So those are some of the laundry list. I'll pause here, but those are some of my concerns about the fact that I think that we have got to become more adept at discussing procedure, being aware of what's expected, and allowing this body to serve as a space of education for the public as well.
Mr. Jacobson.
So I really agree with, I think, everything you said. And maybe the operational issue at this point is maybe there should be a third class of subcommittee or a third grouping, and the third grouping would be a grouping that addresses specifically police procedure and the specifics of police and citizen interaction. So the social science or the sociology grouping that Mr. Rent described is a little bit more abstract than that. It doesn't deal with the nuts and bolts of what actually happens when police officers and citizens interact in Urbana.
Right.
And that's really, really important. I guess the other thing that I'd like to allude to in your remarks is that I do think that the full constellation of community groupings is of interest. In earlier data, there was a striking statistic. It looks statistically significant underrepresentation of Asian drivers in the traffic stops, which now has spiked. I have practically all of the graduate students with whom I work are Asian. So I did a quick survey of them, and I asked them, because I've heard it said in explanation of this, that the Asian students don't have cars. Now, all of the ones that work with me have cars. And I asked them if they're typical or not. They said, no, we all have cars. And I said, well, how, if we see statistics that you are not very often stopped for traffic violations, why is that? And he said, oh, we really obey the law very carefully because we're terrified of being deported. So, it's another sociological thing, another thing that and I don't know how, I don't want to generalize from conversations with just a few people, but this indicates a perspective that could be looked at because it hadn't occurred, certainly before I talked to them, to me. So, yeah, I think that looking at the full spectrum of communities that are impinged on and really looking hard at the specifics of how citizens or residents and whether they're citizens here or visitors, but residents and police interact, I think is very important.
Any other comments on this? Alejandra?
Yes, I do, and I have a question for my colleague. When you're talking and referring about police procedure, what are you exactly you're looking for this committee to be able to look and to learn about that?
I think my interest is in having citizens of the various communities that are represented in the data understand what's expected of them on a stop, why they're being stopped, how that stop is to be executed, what is expected of them during that process, and how we as a committee can facilitate better information. Because I think that we're dealing not only with this issue of statistics, but some of these issues are linguistic. Clearly, you understand this. So being able to work with communities or provide resources in various languages, I think that one of the roles of this committee is not only to come up with a report on what's going wrong, but also come up with some interventions of how we can move forward and have better practice. So that's just my opening offering. The other thing I'll say too is that the reason why I think it's important to look at how various communities are impacted is because when we look at the data, we see that, as far as I know, we talked about this issue of census data being flawed. But what we understand is that if we look at 2000 census data, we're looking at a situation where African Americans represent 14.2% of the population. The Asian community represents 14.3% of the population. However, African Americans are 6 times as likely to be stopped as the Asian community, and 5 times as likely to be cited. So I think the reason why we also want to understand that experience of how two communities can be represented equally in Urbana, but have very different experiences with law enforcement. What we also see is that by 2010, we're in a situation, well, by 2013, we're in a situation, excuse me, I don't mean to have my back to you either, but we're in a situation where the majority community has declined by 7%. We have the white community represented at 60% of the Urbana population. We have the African American community represented at 16.3% of the Urbana population. We have the Asian community now represented at 17% of the population. And yet, we still have these disparities. It's still almost 3 times as likely for an African American to be stopped and cited as an Asian driver. So as the population shifts, the issue of African Americans being stopped continues to hover at 30%. However, again, I think it's important that we're mindful of how each other experience these stops, because the other issue is that with our Latino population, the Latino population is small in this community. However, 73% of Latinos are cited when they're stopped. That's a devastating number. What does it mean to a community to understand that if individuals in my community are stopped, the majority of them will be cited? And citations are an economic issue. So I think that, again, it's important to understand how these communities are all experiencing this issue of being stopped and being cited.
I've got Andrew next. As I'm going through this in my head, I'm trying to divide up the task and the homework assignments here, and
Sure,
what the subcommittee, whether we want 2 subcommittees, and it's sounding at least like this idea of a social science subcommittee, we should at least split it in half to get these 2 aspects of it. Andrew, you had a comment.
My head's kind of swimming because you brought up so many different points and good points. And I think one of the things, the most recent, starting from the most recent and working back, you're talking about the different communities and how do we look at these differences. And I think it's important to remember that socially this community is fluid. It's not just the numbers are changing, but just the general population and the way they live changes. Certainly the disparity with Asian drivers, well, the Asian community of students has changed dramatically to much more of an undergraduate student base versus graduate students, and there's changes constantly, and the same way with the Latino community, where you're getting second generation and third generation, and it's a fluid, all of the communities are fluid. I agree that it's wonderful to have things for the community to see what's expected on traffic stops, what's expected in interactions with the police. I would caution people not to take the 3-minute cops corners as, the absolute last word on any of these subjects. I think that while I look at the committee here and I realize that there's a lot of expertise that I would never dream of being able to possess if I spent the rest of my life trying to attain it. What I do know is about the police department, because I've been here for a long time and I've done a lot of things with the police department in training and in supervising, and I think that one of the things you were alluding to is we need to know a little bit about what are our procedures, so we see how is that affecting the end results. And ultimately, one of the questions for me is, we have these data numbers. Do they need to change, or is this correct, is the ultimate question. Because when IDOT first started, one of the comments that came into my head, or one of the thoughts that came into my head was, we can make these numbers right. But that's the last thing we want to do. Right. We spent, this was 10 years ago IDOT came into effect. I'd been here for 15 years. I had been familiar with the police department for about 5 years before that. We'd spent 20 years trying to tell officers, ignore race. The last thing we want to do is to tell them, concentrate on race, make the numbers match. We don't want to make the numbers match just to make the numbers match. What we want to do is we want to not have practices that unfairly target communities. We don't want to have, and we want to have a good review process, and we want to have good training processes. So I think that your idea that we need to look at how does this police department function is a good thing, and hopefully that's something that we can look at maybe as a group and up front. So we kind of take a look at that and say, now we see how these things are playing into these numbers, and these are the things that we need to change, and these are the things that maybe are right.
Ms. Cornell, you had a comment.
Yes, I do. I just want to get back to Nicole about your answer. And this is what I was looking, because the reason that I get involved into the program and having the opportunity of being able to facilitate this Cup Corner information into Spanish was because this is something that I deal every day. But I will tell you what is the reality that I'm living to. In this community, this is so new. I mean, we have a diverse community because we have the university, but we need to understand that our university community is bilingual. What we have is those members who are coming with those students who may not be bilingual, and they are here, and they don't have any idea what the rule and the expectations or anything. And that might be the reasons that we have this data and how sometimes when we have the Asian community or the Latino community, they dealing with that. So I will be so interested to be in a subcommittee like this, because yes, I think that this committee is not only to prove or saying you're doing something wrong or this is something that is not going well in our city, but I think the education portion of educating our community so that they can avoid to be stopped or being able to know how to interact with law enforcement is great. But the reason that it's only in Spanish so far is because we have this rule in a way. I've been advocating for the Latino community for a number of years. I come and I reach out my police department. I come and I reach out different group in our community because the issues that we have in the Spanish-speaking community is the same issues that we have in the English-speaking community. And so we need to encourage our audience and our community that if you're representing a race or you're representing a group of people who are in this community and they speak a different language, go and come forward. Because I wish I could speak more language, that I can be able to communicate or reach out more individuals, because essentially what we want is to educate our community to avoid those type of problems that we have right now. And the other thing that we have, unfortunately, with the Latino community that it maybe is going to improve now is that the reality is that we have an undocumented community. And the issues that we have, they don't have driver's license. Now we have a law that help them to get the driver's license and have permission to drive. I think that this is going to help immensely the Latino community to reduce the amount of citation, because I know that it's a struggle, and unfortunately, I have to be in both sides. In a way, this is people that I know that I encourage everybody to have a pool car and be able to get rides and those kind of things. But the reality is that sometimes they have families and they have to function. And they have to drive without permission because there was no law to help them out. Now, this is a law that is just start in September and is helping. And that is something that I think that it will help a lot. But I will be totally agree with you if we are taking a subcommittee that is gonna be able to find the expectation, and also we are gonna be able to teach our community what are the rights about how they can execute and actually what if we are going to be moving forward with this project.
So I have a question at this point. I'm hearing what I think might be two different tasks, and I'm wondering if we want to divide it into two different subcommittees. One sounds like police community interaction issues. So what the police procedures are, how they interact with community, how the community interacts with the police on those things. And then the other, I'm having a hard time characterizing it as other than community impacts issues. Is that a reasonably, would that capture all of the issues that all of you have been speaking about? To divide it into those two categories, or is there another way to carve this turkey?
I think when you're talking about police interaction, there need to be what you just mentioned, Nicole. I mean, it's not only the police interaction as, I don't know what it will be the appropriate word to kind of combine procedure, information, education, that it will help our community to avoid what we are actually discussing right now. And it also will help law enforcement to understand the perception that we have. I mean, we have a community policing type of subcommittee, but did you have any?
Yeah, I thought about them coupled because
Yeah, and
they're-
I've been going back and forth in my head as you've been discussing it of, do we need a combined committee because all of these issues weave into each other, or do we need to split up the task or just have multiple tasks that the one committee takes on? I'm open to suggestions here. Todd?
I'm wondering specifically in regards to police procedure and.
Your microphone, please.
I'm wondering specifically in regards to police procedure and the specific areas of engagement and impact that you were discussing, whether or not we could sort of atomize them in the beginning and then
Maybe they
in order to
join-
do very specialized work and get specialized information, bring them back and maybe reformulate committees as you go forward. But that's just a thought.
One of the reasons that I kind of like that idea is I'm also thinking in terms of homework assignments for these subcommittees.
Right.
What am I sending you all off to do and produce in hopefully finite time? Mr. Jacobson.
So it seems to me mathematically the right number of subcommittees is 4. Because if everybody's going to be on a subcommittee and no subcommittee will have as many as 4 members, then we've got to have 4 committees to engage, subcommittees to engage everybody. So,
Or a couple of lazy people like myself.
or a couple of, okay, but see, even if, okay, so I guess if you did not serve on a subcommittee,
We could do 3 subcommittees of
we could
3
3
each.
subcommittees of 3 each, except I'm not sure that Laurel may not appoint somebody else finally, but, or maybe not, I don't know. if
Oh, an
she's
11th member.
an 11th member.
Is
Do you
that
know?
on tap?
I'll have to get back to you on that.
Okay.
Okay.
I'm not sure at this point. So.
And, we can, as against lazy members, we might have some very energetic members who want to serve on 2.
Right.
So we could
So
play
I,
different games along those lines.
yeah, so it seems to me that we sort of have, I could imagine 4 where one would be the social science issues generally, one would be impact on specific communities, one would be police citizen interaction, and one would be statistics, or maybe the social science community and the impacts on individual communities. That could be
Its
one,
own single.
its own single issue. Then we'd have 3, and I guess if we are, if we have 9, if we assign 9 people to committees, and we give you,
Good time.
we give you break, we give you good time for taking on the job of being the chair, then then that would
I get
work
to
out
read all of the homework
mathematically.
assignments when we're all done, so.
Yeah, okay, well, that's
um,
probably fair.
Ms. Avery, please.
Well, I totally agree with Nicole's assessment of a subcommittee and what we should be looking at in terms of the police procedures and the education in terms of the community around the procedures. But I'm also interested in the community assessment of, especially those affected communities in terms of their stops and their experiences during those stops. So I don't know if that anecdotal data would come under the subcommittee that would be looking at the community impacts, where we would actually get those testimony and those experiences of those drivers that are impacted by the disparity that we see. But wherever that is, I'm very interested in that data as well. So if you do have the police procedure statistical, the education subcommittee along with the community impact, I don't know. Wherever that is, I'm very interested in that anecdotal data.
All right, so why don't we try and at least divide into those 3 committees, as we've been loosely talking about them. I think, unfortunately, Mr. Charles, you are the stuckey for one of them, obviously. Who else would like to work with Andrew on sort of the police procedures education aspect of this? One other volunteer. There's only 6 of us here tonight, or 7 of us total.
I would like to.
Okay, great. So Alejandra and Andrew will work on that, police procedures.
Just 2 people?
What's that?
Just 2 on?
Well, at least,
No,
if
for
you want
the
to.
sake of tonight.
For the sake of tonight, and we can regroup when we have a couple of other people. When we put out the minutes of this meeting, and maybe the summary should go out as relatively quickly as possible of the subcommittees, so that people who aren't here get a chance to volunteer for what we leave open. So we have that aspect. Ms. Cobb, would you like to be the stuckey for community impact end of what you were thinking about, or I don't know how you want to describe that portion of the work?
You know, the truth is that each one of these committees will be dealing, my hope is that they will deal with impact.
That's right.
So
That's
I don't
right.
think
So that's
anybody
probably
gets
too
off
broad a
scot-free.
way to describe it.
Yeah.
I'm willing to defer to you for a title for this subcommittee.
The one that,
So that
you are doing police procedure.
police procedure and education. What do we want to call this next bit? And then the statistical subcommittee, I'm about to look over to Mr. Testa and make him the stuckey for that one.
I'll volunteer with that.
Okay, so we've got 2 volunteers for the statistics end and figuring out those. So what do we want to call this 3rd subcommittee?
You all talked about social science.
Mhm.
Kind of, social, well, originally we talked about social science and community impacts.
And I agree, that's just too broad it covers everything that we're gonna do in some sense. And, but we can, I mean, the label's not important, we can call it that subcommittee, and you've laid out a bunch of things that subcommittee really needs to be looking at. I'm happy to just leave it as social science and communities, and we can retitle it later if you're inclined.
Yeah, if no one else has any language, for the moment, I'd keep it as it is, in the
Okay.
absence of a snazzier title.
Uh-huh.
Or more.
I am fine with that. So we'll just refer to it generally as the Social Science Committee for the moment. And once the work starts, I think, you know, once the homework assignments start, I think we'll start to hone down on what we want to call that in the end. But I think that's fine for the moment. So, yeah, go ahead, please.
Well, I was gonna say, I mean, to the extent that the police procedure and impacts was something that I kind of raised, is it a possibility for me to be on that?
Absolutely.
particular-
If you want to be the
Because it was either
third.
that or statistics, which was really kind of calling to me. So-
Right. I'm happy to approach this anyway, and we've got other members who we can volunteer in their absence for. Ms. Avery, please.
I'd like to make a suggestion or a
Please.
recommendation in terms of the Social Science Community Impact Subcommittee. I think that should be a committee of the whole, to be quite honest, because that is the overall work of this committee is how these stops impact these communities. So I think that committee should be a committee of the whole.
So, and the only
I
downside
want
there.
you on it, I want you on it.
And the only downside there, I will say, is once we do committee of the whole thing, we do have to do open meetings. So we have to announce and all that, which maybe isn't a problem. The other thing is, you can hear, I hope, the gears in my head turning of, I want to assign people homework assignments to go do and produce something. And I fear that I will be the stucky for the committee of the whole assignments to make sure that we get those
Well, you
together.
can assign a
and
chair for that. I
Okay.
mean, you don't have to be the person
That's
stuck
true.
with it. You could still
Mr.
assign a chair.
Charles.
I do agree that that's something that everybody should be involved in, but perhaps we could subdivide that particular committee into how, because the different communities are impacted differently. There are a lot of things that are the same, but there are a lot of things that are also different. So there are some unique, I think, you've pointed out that the Asian community is impacted in a unique way, perhaps.
I have no,
Ms. Avery.
I have no problem taking some type of a leadership on that committee.
Okay, that sounds great. And maybe the way to approach that, I kind of like this idea that in those terms, maybe get at least one or two folks with an assignment of a particular community to give us a small report on, and that might really more clearly define the task ahead. So let's see if, and Eric,
Yeah, you haven't heard from me.
yes, where do you
So,
want to
yeah,
find yourself?
I'm really interested in all of these. I'd be glad to, even if I don't serve on the committee, be glad to be on the mailing list for the statistics committee, because I work with statistics all the time, and if I can possibly contribute, and if you're gonna have 3 other people at the meeting, don't ask me to come, but if there's any chance, or if I can talk to you one-on-one about that, I'd be glad to.
So,
But that being said, okay, that committee's spoken for. I would imagine if the one committee that people aren't sort of jumping all over and wanting to be on is actually the committee that Mr. Wren talked about first, the Social Science Committee. I would be glad to serve on that, and I would say roughly what I think I would focus on would be to really explore the peer-reviewed literature, the scholarly literature that relates to this topic, try to organize it so that we get as good a picture as possible of what the best thinking has been about this issue really across the nation, and what have studies in different communities brought to bear on this. And although I'm not a social scientist, this is the way I actually approach lots of issues that come before the council. Is I go to the peer-reviewed literature and try to read the social science that relates to it. So, and I have, because I'm at the university, I have access to all the journals that the university subscribes to, the university library subscribes to. So, I would be glad to contribute that kind of research, and also then participate in meetings of the Social Science Committee.
Likewise, I would, as an ostensible social scientist, be interested in these issues, and So I don't know what that does in terms of.
Yeah, I mean, I hear, okay, so let's see, go around the table once and see if everybody's got enough homework to do. So I hear, Ms. Avery, you want to start looking at impacts of particular community, and I think, you know, the obvious first order one for all of us is going to be the African American community. If you want to take on at least that assignment, and I don't know if anyone wants to join Miss Avery in that homework assignment first go round. I hear Mr. Charles and Miss Cornell probably start talking about the police issues, and Ms. Cobb, did you also want to be part of that discussion, at least initially? Mr. Testa and Mr. Kyles already had mentioned, I heard in this year, that statistics issues, and you thought, Mr. Jacobson, you might want to be involved in that. We also have to hear from our other members who aren't here. I know we have one other person who is heavily involved in that area, so why don't we put out the call and see where we end up. But at least I'll make you, Mr. Testa, the Stuckey for organizing how we're going to approach the data, what kinds of benchmarks and those sorts of issues. And all of these I take as a first cut kind of assignment for each of these groups, you know, more or less a framework and outline of where we're going to go. And maybe we come up next month with, okay, we've got the outline of what we think is going to end up in the final report. And then obviously the statistics folks, we're going to have to ask for some analyses, and that'll come up later. But I think the general outlines. Any other assignments that need to be done? Ms. Avery?
Just have a technical question, because we did strike all the verbiage that pertaining to hearings. So does that mean that the committee will not have any hearings?
So, Mr. Rent.
Yeah, I can address that. So hearings in terms of when you're dealing with these meetings from a technical standpoint are hearings where evidence is presented, where there are two opposing parties. So to use hearings, it's sort of in a general parlance, you would think that's where you're getting lots of community input, but specifically when you're dealing with sort of governmental or quasi-governmental committees, what you're really talking about are very formal sort of adjudicative hearings. And I would think that what we're thinking more of would be closer to sort of community focus groups. And so I would think that as long as we keep that distinction in mind, we probably don't need to sort of revisit the hearings in terms of the bylaws.
Okay.
Yeah, and you know, we can call a meeting and ask for input from any number of people, and that still counts as a meeting as far as the Open Meetings Act goes. Yeah, hearings are more like a trial, and I don't think we're going to have any of those sorts of things as part of our work. Have we divided up the work at least preliminarily here enough, and enough to ask our other members what they might want to be involved in? Have you two scribbled down enough to know what all folks are doing, or would you like me to circle the table and?
Yeah, I think it would be good to circle the table again.
All right.
You can always play back.
That's fine. So Ms. Avery, you're going to start us on sort of individual community and start with the African American community and what we might be looking for as far as impacts to that community. Mr. Charles, Ms. Cobb, Ms. Cornell, you're going to start discussing police community interactions and education issues. Mr. Jacobson, Mr. Kyle, well, Mr. Kyles and Mr. Testa are going to start with statistics, certainly, and we'll get you involved in if ad hoc if that works out. And you wanted to work on literature search on the bigger social science end.
Right.
So that seemed, so Mr.
Yeah, I'll organize a report in a bibliography or some comments in a bibliography.
I think that sounds like a good start, and then we've got a couple of other members. So if you would put a message out to folks who weren't able to make it tonight and see where they're at and what they would like to join into, Yes, Ms. Cornell.
I also want to suggest that I will not mind to go and to check in the impact on the Latino community.
Yes, of course,
And,
thank you.
I mean, I don't mind to check into the Asian community, and that is something that I do in my job, so that
So
will be
I-
not a problem.
That's great, and so I think, yes, if you would work with Ms. Avery on sort of the structure of how we're gonna present those
Sure.
sort of pieces of the report, so that we have sort of a common theme, that'd be great.
Oh, yeah,
And
sure.
Yes.
I guess I would just also comment, I don't think there's anything in our, in our mandate or in the rules or so forth that prevents us from individually engaging people in the community. So if there's someone we know who's just like a real whiz at statistical analysis, or if there's a particular scholar locally who, would turn up in my literature search, I just, he's local, or she is local, I would just go talk to them. I also wanted to ask a question about the Latino community. Would it be, we don't have any, this group doesn't have any financial resources really to, play with to implement our mission. However, within that context, I don't know if anybody, if you know of anybody who would like to translate the documents that we produce into Spanish.
It's an interesting question, and I don't know if we can get some monetary support from the city to do that, but we can certainly ask for volunteers if that's available. But translating it to Spanish and depending on our findings and how broad the report is, translating it to other languages might also be interesting. I don't know how you feel about finding someone to do that on more of a pro bono basis, but we can check with the city and see if they would be willing to provide actual resource.
Well, I will not mind to look into that or any resources, but just a specific talking about every single document.
Well, I think the really important thing, it might be our final report, but also the materials that relate to individual police and resident contacts. If those, if
The educational
the
materials.
educational materials specifically, maybe not our minutes, not all this tedious stuff that absolutely nobody will care about, except a few good government fanatics, and I don't mean to disparage them, but it's a very small number of people who really want to look at minutes and stuff like that. But I think the education materials and maybe the final report would be very might be really beneficial to do that.
In terms of the educational, I will be more than willing, and you don't have to pay me for this because this is something that I do, and for me, it's better if we educate the community and not looking for any compensation about that. About the final report, I don't mind to kind of provide resources and things that we can translate the document. But again, for the education, this is why I want to be involved in this committee.
Great.
And I will not mind to do that because this is what I do for Cup Corner, and I'm more than willing to do that for us.
So, and in terms of the final report, I'd ask you to communicate with Todd if resources can be made available. I don't have expectations that you were going to sit down and translate our entire final report.
Oh, no. And as we will be studying this, we will be able to see what other language it will be good to have in our population. I will tell you right now, the population that we have of the language that we speak, the first three language that we have is English, Spanish, Korean, are the three majority
Interesting.
language that we have in our community.
So that might be well worth it. All right. Anything else on initial assignments? I will remind folks that so long as you're talking to 3 people or less, you are fine to communicate by email. If you end up with 4 people, you start to broach into needing an open meeting in order to do that. So please, if we've got committees of 3, I think we're all okay to just communicate by email about, okay, this is the approach we're going to be taking and things like that. So 2 or 3 people, that's just fine. Anything else, please send through Todd or Tony so that they can redistribute stuff to other folks.
Yeah, and maybe, I'm sure you all know, but just, it's another reminder, anything that you put in an email that relates to the business of this committee is foiable.
Absolutely. So freedom of information, people can acquire that. As much of our work as we can, I'd like to be publicly accessible. So, but yes, absolutely keep in mind that making funny comments in the background, thinking that they're just among your co-committee members is probably something you want to think about. All right. Anything additional on our subcommittees? I think we've got a good start. And what I'd like to see, I think, as far as if you all need a deadline of some sort, I know Todd needs to get information for the packet, or Tony, a week before the meeting. So what I think we should aim for, when is our next meeting? It is August 20th. And so normally that would mean by August 13th to have everything pretty much ready to go. I think we should all have a deadline of whatever you're going to produce, and obviously much of this is going to be in initial form. Let's have the deadline be the 11th of August, that Monday, the Monday of the week before the meeting, and that way if there's a little overrun, that's fine, but you can at least put on your calendar, have an initial thing ready for Todd by the 11th, and that'll give you at least a 1-day slip if you need it. And I think that should be plenty of time for you to get the packet together. Good. So we've done public input already. Do we have anything by way of a staff report this time?
Not at this time.
All right. And I was just reminded while looking at information that one thing we forgot to put on the agenda this time, but we will put it on next time, is approval of minutes. So we can add that to our regular agenda, and we'll get last month's and this month's minutes approved next month. So I've got one announcement on the list. Todd, did you want to? So for those of you who have not gone online and done your open meetings training, please do take care of that. It's not so bad. Any other announcements by task force members? Great. So I would entertain a motion to adjourn at this point.
So
Move
moved.
we adjourn.
Second.
All right. So I have a motion by Ms. Avery, a second by Mr. Jacobson. Anything further? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
And any opposed? We stand adjourned. Thank you very much.